There has been a big problem with women's MMA and why everybody has been talking about it. Most recently, Dana White has announced 3 women's MMA fights in UFC 300, and a lot of the people are not happy about it at all. But we can talk about UFC 300 later. Let's give some reasons why women's MMA is just more boring. And this is not a hate video or anything, just saying. Reason number 1, no finishes. Women's fights are just more boring and they have way less power than men MMA fights. I have some stats for you, but before we get into that, if you're not already subscribed, please do so and hit the subscribe button. While you're down there, hit the like button. You can always unsubscribe later if you feel. Thanks. Now let's get back into the video. Here are some of the stats that I have for you. I did not get them personally. I'll leave a link down in the description where I got them. Women's fighters throw 40% more strikes per round, but only end in KO by TKO 21% of the time, while men's fight ends in TKO 30% of the time. So they throw more strikes, but they do not have more power, and the fights do not end in KO TKO. Also, knockdowns are rare in men and women's fights, but you'd have to watch 16 rounds of male UFC fights to see one knockdown. But if you compare that to women, you have to watch 50 rounds of female UFC fights just to see one knockdown. So way less action, less power, less knockdowns, and less screaming of excitement over what just happened, since that is a big part and a amazing fun factor of why people watch the UFC. And these are comparing results from 200 male and 200 female UFC fighters in the same weight, 125 to 145 pounds. So you don't get like heavyweights. And also one thing, women's fights ends in decision 65% of the time, while men's end in decision 45.5% of the time. And with more control time, women have 17 seconds more of control time than men do, but with that, the fights end in submission only 13.5% of the time, when men's fights end in submission 24% of the time, even with less control time. Since most people watch UFC since it's so exciting, all the knockdowns, bleeding, submission, this is why women's MMA is becoming very talked about in a bad way. Since the majority of the time, you do not see none of that. But let's get out of the stats part. Let's go to reason number 2, the divisions. No, not the weight, but the contenders in the division. Let's just give an example. Jessica Andrade is one of the fighters Dana White announced on UFC 300. She is 1-3 in her last 4, one loss coming in another division, but she's ranked number 4 in her division. But this isn't just about winning and losing. It's about the champions over the contenders. Wei Li is currently the champion, and she seems like she is miles above the rest of the contenders, and we can give an example of that. Currently, she is fighting also on UFC 300, and she is a minus 345 favorite against the number 1 contender in her division. Yes, upsets do happen, but if she is this big of a favorite against the number 1 contender, imagine the number 5, the number 6, number 7 fighters. Because in other divisions, maybe the number 6 fighter has a good chance to beat the champion, or the number 5 fighter, the number 7 fighter has a close enough odds to beat the champion. But in women's fights, just seems like the champion is just miles and miles above. Also, there's just not many good, skilled, exciting fighters to watch. Only a couple women's MMA fighters in every single division combined I can name that I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good fight and I'm excited to watch it. But with men's division, there are many in each division that I can name. And the women's bantamweight division is just a whole nother level of bad. The most recent title fight was a perfect demonstration of the women's divisions and why so many people are talking about women's MMA just being awful. And Dana White adding 3 women's fights to UFC 300 is getting a lot of the people mad. But for why women's MMA is getting so much hate, talking about the bantamweight division just makes it so easy. The easiest argument. It's like saying who's better at basketball, LeBron or a 3-year-old. Like, the bantamweight division is just one of the worst divisions you would ever see. I can go all day of how bad and boring the bantamweight division is, but it'll just take up way too much time, so I'll just make it a little quick. Holly Holm is still ranked number 5, half of the top 15 most people have never heard of. And for the champions, it's going to be the champion versus the rightful contender. And that means that it will be a championship fight. So it's 5 rounds, and most likely to be co-main on a pay-per-view card. A big example of this is Rose versus Carla. Rose was an exciting fighter who, me personally, I was excited to watch all of her fights. She was a good fighter, but she pulled out one of the most boring 5 rounds fights in UFC history. And Michael Chandler's knockout was on that card against Tony. And then after that was the amazing 1 round against Charles and Gaethje. So it kind of just kills the whole vibe of the arena after seeing a 5 round, just extremely boring women's MMA fight that they have to watch, since it has to be that high up on the card, since it is a championship fight. But let's just go into reason number 3. There are no big names. A big thing of the men's MMA scene is that there are massive names like Conor, Izzy, new names like Alex Pereira coming into the scene that people follow them, they watch their interviews, they're so excited about them, and they just go on Instagram, they check out all that stuff. But for a women's MMA fighter, I can remember the last time that I was like, oh, I'm going to watch this interview, or oh, I'm going to go on their Instagram to see what they're doing. There has just been no big names since Ronda Rousey was the reason why women's MMA in the UFC became a thing. And after she left, there has been no one to fill her shoes. Amanda is the GOAT of women's MMA. She is nowhere near the star power of Ronda. Holly Holm, who was the first to beat her in that amazing fashion, nowhere near the big name. So all these women's MMA fighters, like Joanna was a big name, but not even like a fraction of what Ronda was. And now that they are all retired, Amanda's retired, Joanna's retired, Rose like lost all her big hype, lost the belt, all that stuff. There's just been not a single women's MMA fighter to even be a fraction of what Ronda Rousey, and that just leaves the excitement. But yeah, let me know in the comments anything else you guys have, any ideas. Make sure you subscribe. Peace out.